Okay, thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Kim Koyama. I'm with Japanese Canadians for Social Justice, and just going to go through some preliminary introductions and rules. First of all, for those who are not familiar with us, Japanese Canadians for Social Justice, or JCSJ, is a Toronto-based organization of multi-generational Japanese, Japanese Canadian, Nikkei identified people and allies. We are an anti-racist, anti-colonialist organization which supports the struggles for justice, freedom, and liberation around the world and at home. Japanese Canadians for Social Justice's mandate is to support the struggle for justice, not just for Japanese Canadians, but for all who suffer and call our name. JCSJ has organized public events such as a screening of Afterburn, the documentary about US military occupation in Okinawa, as well as a teach-in on migrant workers' rights. JCSJ has marched in the streets with Grassy Narrows First Nation in their fight for justice and health. We rallied and deputed to support the fight for safe shelter and social housing in the city of Toronto. JCSJ aims to build community support for human rights and social justice, and to work in solidarity and support with other communities and organizations. And I'd like to start by acknowledging we live on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. The current treaty holders of this land are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. We acknowledge that truth is still being fought for and that reconciliation requires action. We call for concrete action that brings clean drinking water, decent education, and proper access to health care to all First Nations and Indigenous communities. We call for adequate housing on and off reserve. We call for justice as reconciliation. Japanese Canadians for Social Justice recognizes that our organizing takes place on lands acquired through genocide and colonialism against Indigenous peoples. Okay, just before we start, I'd like to let everyone know that we will be taking questions and doing a Q&A session after our two speakers. If you have any questions that come up during the discussion, please feel free to type your questions into the chat. You see the chat option probably at the bottom of your screen. And we can't promise to get to all questions, in time permitting. We'll get to as many as we can. So please do feel free to type us your questions. I also like to make sure everyone understands that this is a safe space, free from harassment. Anyone whose questions or comments go off topic or are in any way harassing will be ejected from this meeting. Okay, and that said, we're going to start off hearing from one of our two invited speakers. Gaetan Heroux has organized with Toronto's homeless people for more than 30 years. He's the author of Toronto's Poor, A Rebellious History. Welcome, Gaetan.
Yeah, hi, Kim, and thank you for having me here to talk. So I'm going to speak no more than 25 minutes. It could be a little earlier, but definitely not more than 25 minutes. What I'm going to do is give you a very broad view of some of the history of the neighborhood, some of the key moments in terms of government cutbacks, and about three examples of how over the years, the unemployed and the poor have organized around their poverty. So let me start. I'm going to be reading from some notes sometimes, so sometimes not, but a lot of times just to make sure I get some of the details out. So here we go. So the first part is just a brief history, taking us up to just before the Second World War, around the neighborhood and stuff. So in the 1840s in Toronto, relief to the poor was administered primarily by two poorhouses. One was called the House of Industry, and the other was called the House of Providence. And they were responsible for distributing relief, which would have been welfare at the time, and also had a residence there where people were taken in And the housing industry was probably the most prominent one and dominated the lives of poor people for more than 100 years. In the 1850s, the industrialization of Toronto started. 1852 was when the railroads came in, and that's very important. And by 1873, the industrialization was in full force. And just south of the east downtown Toronto, which had been on Lake Shore, down by Sherbourne and Parliament and stuff, you would have all these industries. Thousands of workers would have been there. As a result of that, workers' cottages emerged all around the industry, and that's where Cabbagetown came out of, and there was actually, even as far back as 1873, slum conditions that existed in Toronto and Cabbagetown, the ward, up until after the Second World War. Another big event, the worldwide event, was between 1873 and 1900. There was a major recession and depression. And this was very important because thousands of people were affected. Poor people became unemployed, didn't have work. And when they did have work, it wouldn't be for the whole year. Sometimes it would be for 40 weeks or 30 weeks. It was during this period that the housing industry introduced a work test where the unemployed had to crack stone to get their relief. The idea was that if you made people do a work test, that the unemployed wouldn't apply for relief. So it was meant to deter people. And there are many, many examples, which I won't refer to tonight, of the unemployed actually organizing around the cracking stone issue and around the work tests. Just one quick thing, in 1909, about 1,000 unemployed organized by the socialists went to the city and demanded that they be allowed to use St. Andrew's Hall for meetings. This was really, really significant because, if you had wanted to organize, you needed a place to meet. And the unemployed were often forced to meet, sometimes in cold weather, wet weather outside in parks and stuff. And they demanded the use of that and actually won the use of St. Andrew's Halls in the end. We're going to move up to the Great Depression now. One thing that we have to understand is when the Great Depression came, thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people became unemployed. There was no unemployment insurance at the time, no national housing program, and no health insurance. Relief responsibility was with the municipalities. As a result of the Great Depression, they were overwhelmed by the crisis. In the end, in 1933, the city actually takes over the relief from the House of Industry because it was so big, and so they take control of that. The House of Industry was a charitable organization. In 1933, the municipality takes over and now becomes the responsibility of the municipality to make sure that people have enough relief. One of the interesting thing around the welfare department, Commissioner Laver, that's in the history is that they openly talk about making the hostels as uncomfortable as possible because they didn't want people to come to the city. And they want to deter the unemployed. A lot of time at that point during the Great Depression, hundreds of unemployed would flood the city to try and find employment. Were unable to do so and were forced to use the hostels. It wasn't until 1933 that the Campbell report came out and set the relief rates for the municipalities in Ontario, because it was all over the place before that. So they gave a minimum that people could get for relief. And also the federal government, because of the crisis was so big, was also forced to give grants during the Great Depressions to deal with the crisis. And often cuts to relief in Ontario were directly linked to cuts to grants that were cut by the federal government. So when you look at the history, you'll see that when Toronto will make cuts, or Ontario would make the cuts, then it was because just before that, the feds said, we're cutting your grants. And during the Great Depression in Toronto, well, across Canada, it was the communists and the socialists that were at the forefront of resistance during the Great Depression. Now, the kinds of things that were happening during the Great Depression, in terms of how the homeless, the unemployed were organizing, there was huge free speech battles. there was call for the elimination of hostels by the unemployed. And they, at the time, the men were asking for $5 a week cash relief. And also huge organization against evictions throughout the Great Depression. Sometimes there would be pitched battles with the police. Often, they would just take over the house or protect the house, and were able to win, make arrangements with the city so people didn't have to leave. Sometimes they would last, weeks, 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Also, another is a tactic that they use is they would take over relief offices and organize relief strikes. Sometimes they would even take out their kids out of school to put pressure on the municipalities to get them relief. So what I want to do right now is I want to take you through one of these examples of one of the actions that happened during the Great Depression. It happened in 1936. It was the largest relief strike since the Great Depression began. It involved 10 municipalities. Over 5,000 families were involved. So what happens in the late winter and spring of 1936, the federal government pares back relief grants to the provinces. And then then Premier Mitchell, Premier Hepburn, who was cuts family allowance by 10% and eliminates relief to single unemployed. And part of what was going on also, Hepburn said, was it was a way also to ensure that some of the families that had, so he argued that some of the families had made relief their careers. So there's a strong prejudice, even during this crisis when the unemployment was directly linked to the economic crisis and had nothing to do with poor people making career out of relief. So the people who were involved in this were the Communist Party and the Socialists. They were the main organizers, not the only organizers. And one of the townships that was leading this relief strike was the York Township. So on June 1st, 1936, 50 York relief workers refused to undertake their duties collecting garbage. Throughout the Depression, the municipalities were using the unemployed to do work that normally would be paid for. So clean garbage, maintain parks, all that kind of stuff. And so they refused to do that. And within a day, all relief sites in the township were picketed. At the time, the relief officer warned the strikers that there would be penalties if the strikers refused to work, which included that they would further cut their relief, and they would stop their cash payments and replace them with voucher payments. There was a big battles in the 1930s in terms of getting a voucher even when you do your relief. But many of the unemployed organizations argued for cash relief, largely because of vouchers focused primarily on food. And if you had the cash, it would go for food, but also they needed, stuff like everyone needs. They needed mattresses, they needed, furniture, they needed, dishes, all that kind of stuff. And you couldn't get that with food vouchers. And at some point during when the strike began, the single unemployed set up an encampment on an empty lot, which they called Red Square. Now, not long after, by the end of June, Lakeview, Mimico, Humber Bay, Westmount, Alderwood, and Long Branch had all joined the strike, the relief strike. Again, like I said, 500,000 families were involved in the relief strike. Just so you understand what that would mean, if you have 2 parents and an average of 4 kids, you're talking about 30 to 40,000 people who are now on strike, on a relief strike, where their relief is compromised. And some municipalities, they cut off the relief totally if you weren't on strike. And then as this is all happening, the federal government is announcing another 25% cut to all relief support to the provinces for the summer months of July, August, and September. And just so you get a sense of what that means, it means that the allocations shrunk in Ontario from $8,900 to $700,000. Again, there's a direct link here to the cuts by the province and municipalities to the federal government. And I'm going to go back to that, in terms of later, because often we don't see the context of these cuts, and because we see what's directly in front of us, and then we have a hard time understanding everything that's going on. At a mass meeting, women vote to storm the relief office and inform the relief officer, Gaetan, that they will be coming and to talk to him, and promise nothing less than a showdown. Also at the time, what's happening is the merchants are ending the practice of extending credit to the unemployed. I remember when my parents would go to the grocery store and would have a credit rating there, and when they didn't have money, and they could have a credit in terms of buying food. So what's happening during the Great Depression, because people are having a hard time, and some of them now their relief is cut, or they're not getting it, or having to get credit, the merchants say no vouchers, no food. That becomes their policy, because it's the as you know, the Great Depression lasted almost 10 years. On July 24th, the York women, many with baby carriages, occupy the relief office, the York relief office, and we've refused to let the relief officer leave until he restores relief. Husbands bring soup and sandwiches during the occupation. The siege ends later, after the Reeve negotiates with occupiers and authorizes the relief officer to issue emergency relief vouchers to the families. Again, a takeover in office, an occupation for hours, which eventually leads to getting some vouchers. As a result of this action, York Council posts a lone police officer in the relief office. So this thing is happening in York, but while all this is happening in York, in Lakeview, which is another municipalities just west of Toronto, the council there enforces what they call a no work, no relief policy. And that was very, very common when the unemployed held relief strikes, that they would just cut them off relief totally. Sometimes they would hold on, because councils were reluctant to do that, because they would be starving children, right? And that wasn't that great. But as a result of that, Lakeview women surround the home of Reeve Dennison, demanding emergency vouchers to be issued. The Reeve is not home, so next day, the women occupy the relief office and hold Relief Officer Moore prisoner for 12 hours. Unemployed strikers later join women's occupation, plaster the relief office with walls with posters, and hang Kroll in effigy. Kroll was the Minister of Welfare at the time. From the building. And just after midnight, Reeve Dennison agrees to issue vouchers for the full week to the unemployed. Things come to a head on July 6th. 2,000 York unemployed marched to the relief office. 50 women crashed the door of the building and try to make their way up the stairs. The police officer tries to beat him back with a baton. The women become enraged and chase him up the door. He hides behind the relief office door. The women break down the door, throw chairs at the officer, and then begin to hold the relief officer and 13 assistants hostage that afternoon. Police reinforcements is called. After a brief battle, they're unable to disperse the crowd. Just so you understand, so by the evening, an estimated 4,000 supporters are outside the relief office as all of this is going on. This is an event, in York and in municipalities. It's a huge, huge event. As a result of all this going on, the Reeve Magwood actually calls council to the relief office, and they hold a meeting at 10:30 in the morning and begin to negotiate with the occupiers. And in the end, the councils agrees to give them everything that they ask for, including reinstate the unemployed, single employed on relief, and also to return the relief rates back to what they were. Similarly, in the North York women that afternoon hold council in North York hostage and refuse to let them leave until they get emergency relief vouchers, and they get them. 2 days later in Etobicoke, the relief strikers kidnap Reeve Armstrong and Relief Officer Grubb, hold them hostage for 24 hours. Police from other municipalities and across Toronto, Ontario come, and then when the unemployed hear that, the word spreads. Truckloads of unemployed from other municipalities go and to Etobicoke to support the unemployed there. A bloodbath is avoided when Reeve Armstrong agrees to several concessions. That day, when the Reeve was let go, Hepburn has an emergency cabinet meeting. He blames the communists for agitating throughout the municipalities and causing trouble. Arrest warrants are issued for the leaders of the strikes. 2 spectacular midnight raids happen. 28 people are arrested in Etobicoke and in York. Ironically, no women are arrested at all, and they were in the middle of this. And eventually, the charges are dropped. So this is just one of many, many examples of how the unemployed organized during the Great Depression. And it was one of the largest relief strikes in Toronto. And I just, give you a flavor, and people want to talk a bit more about that when we're done. We'll do that. The next thing I'm going to do now is just, again, give you a broad overview of some key things regarding some of these issues which will be after the Second World War. So I'll just go through a list of things that are very quick, and then we'll go. So one important thing is that unemployment insurance, which was being fought back, I think, as early as the 1910s, is introduced in 1942. So now, people are paying into it. The employer and the government are paying into it, so that now people have unemployment insurance. A national housing program is created. And a large part of why it's created also is because many of the veterans who were returning from the war were unable to find housing for themselves and their family. And so that in Montreal and in Vancouver, they actually took over barracks and buildings and hotels to force the government to give them housing. So a national housing program is created after the Second World War. Another important thing is in Saskatchewan, the healthcare in the early 1960s, healthcare is introduced and eventually it's across all provinces across Canada will have a healthcare system. In 1966, the Canadian Assistance Plan is introduced, and this is where the government gives the provinces money to pay for social programs, and they agree, for instance, to pay 50% of the relief costs, 30% for the province, and 20% for the municipalities. So again, you can see 50% is a lot of money. And again, these transfer payments were not just around the social programs like welfare and stuff, but also around education, healthcare, and that kind of stuff. Another important thing that happens is the deindustrialization of the country, but in Toronto also, and this had a huge effect in East Toronto, downtown East Toronto, because as we mentioned, thousands of workers were there, and then when the industries began to leave, the work left, and that caused a lot of problems. Thousands of jobs would have been lost then. Another important event in the mid 1960s is as a result, after the First World War and during the Great Depression, many of the wealthy people left the downtown east. And it was not until 1965 that the wealthy began to come back and the area began to be gentrified and continues to be gentrified today. By the 1970s in downtown East Toronto, large infrastructure of social services existed. Hostel, flop houses, rooming houses, drop-ins, community health centers, and legal clinics. So that whole infrastructure was in that area. In 1975, or by 1975, worldwide attacks on the welfare states begins. So for instance, in the 1880s and 1990s, there were major attacks against social programs or the welfare state by Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. And in the US, it was Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. In Canada, it was Brian Mulroney and Jean Chrétien. And just so you know, that the worst attacks against the welfare state, the social programs, was not necessarily by Thatcher, Reagan, and Mulroney, but by Tony Blair, who's a Labor Party, by Bill Clinton's Democrats, and by Jean Chrétien's Liberal. Some of the worst cuts happened in those years, and we'll talk a little bit about those cuts in a second. In the early 1990s, the Conservatives capped transfer payments to Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. So we talked about the Canadian Assistance Plan that was created in 1966, but now the government, the federal government, was saying, okay, if it goes above so much, not more, we won't pay more than 5%. If it goes up any higher, we're not going to pay the difference. And that was a lot of money. And in 1993, the Liberal government eliminates National Housing Program. In 1994, Liberals announce billions of cuts of dollars in unemployment insurance, transfer payments to the provinces. So that means welfare programs, education, healthcare are all affected. And with these announcements come a lot of poor bashing, because it's really hard, if you have an idea after the Second World War that unemployment insurance, welfare, housing are a right, and you announce that you're going to cut that right, it's really hard. So they begin to poor bash and really attack, particularly those receiving unemployment insurance and welfare. In 1995, Mike Harris, Premier of Ontario, cuts welfare on September 1995. In early 1996, 17,000 units of housing that were to be built or canceled. And later, the Tories download responsibility to housing to the municipalities. Again, most of the work that OCAP did, a lot of OCAP focused on the municipalities and Ontario, but it's clear that if you look at what was happening before all of that happened, which were the cuts by the Liberals in 1994, and they cut the social housing, that it was necessary, if we're going to address these issues around welfare rates, around housing, that the federal government be involved. Historically, they've always had to be involved. We saw that in the Great Depression and here. And then in 1998, the Toronto Disaster Committee works and organizes, and then eventually, I think in November of 1998, the city declares homelessness a national disaster and calls for the feds to create a national housing policy, a 1% solution. Again, if we're going to deal with a housing crisis, it cannot be dealt without the feds pouring billions of dollars. Okay, I'm going to stop there in terms of there's a little bit more, but I'll just stop there for that. I just want to end with the, how am I doing here? Okay, I guess, yeah, still about 10, 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to end by just giving you a couple of examples. So one of the groups that organized during these attacks on social services and on the poor was the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, of which I was a member for a long time. And we used various tactics throughout our history, and one of the things that one of the most successful campaign that we had was a Raise Their AIDS campaign, where we fought for the special diet allowance. Now, the special diet allowance was an allowance that was given, administered through the municipalities, funded by the Ontario government, and where if a family got a doctor or nurse practitioner to sign a form, if they had a condition, medical condition, they could get extra money, up to $250. Now, by the way, this special diet allowance existed in the 1930s, where doctors would actually write notes for clients, and they would get the allowance. And the first clinic, that OCAP did was in February 2005, and it was done in Toronto Housing building. Flyers were distributed, and then 2 nurses came, signed forms. About 60 people had their forms signed. The next day, OCAP got a call from one of the parents and said that the welfare worker had accepted their form and got an extra $1,500 a month for a year. It was huge development in terms of OCAP's work, and then from there, it's just skyrocketed. It just, OCAP then began to organize hunger clinics across the city. Other anti-poverty organizations began to organize in their own communities, such as Belleville, Kingston, Peterborough, Guelph, Sudbury, Kitchener, and Ottawa. And it was a huge project that went for more than 5 years in terms of organizing. And throughout that period, OCAP also organized a massive demonstration. One of the big demonstrations that we did was a mass hunger clinic on the front lawns of Queen's Park, where we brought 30 medical workers and set up offices there, and 1,000 people came and got their forms signed. There were other actions such as, crashing the metropolitan, the Liberal fundraiser. There was also, a group of Somalian women in OCAP went to Metro Hall, and they occupied the 12th floor of Metro Hall, where the welfare office, headquarters were, and refused to leave. And they only left after they were threatened with arrest, and the ETF came. And there were numerous examples of OCAP throughout the campaign, not just like doing the work of getting, setting up the clinics, but also protesting and demanding. And it wasn't until much later, in March 25, 2010, that the Minister of Finance, Dwight Duncan, announced that he was going to, the Liberal government was going to cut the allowance, the relief diet, the special diet allowance. And the next day, 20 OCAP members confronted him on a live taping of TV Ontario, dropped a banner and demanded that the welfare rates come. There was one doctor, Dr. Wong, who was very important, who did an estimated 31,000 cases, filled out 31,000 forms for the special relief. He was eventually, charged and taken in front of the board, where doctors go when they say that they're doing things. He was known as a Robin Hood doctor. He was a very important doctor who worked directly with OCAP around these issues. I never went to some of those clinics that he held. I don't know if AJ would have attended some of those, but they were wild, tons of people. So one of the reasons I mentioned this example is because I think it's the reason it was very important for OCAP is one is it put millions of dollars in poor people's pockets, and that was very important. But also, as an organization, you have to have work for people to do, and this particular campaign had all kinds of things for people to do. We had to set up the clinics. We had to have people there, to register people. We had to do all those things. We had to answer phone calls. We were hearing about 100 phone calls a day, at the OCAP office. We had to fight for people who were being denied, their special diet, refuse. So all kinds of stuff. And also what it did, it also connected us to a whole bunch of communities that OCAP had not, even in Toronto, that OCAP had no contact with. And also with people that, we worked with, but not to this extent. So, registered nurses and doctors, community centers, where most of the clinics were held. And all of this, and also, the clinics, hunger clinics, spread across Ontario. So people began to do their own clinics in other places. So this was very, very significant for an organization like OCAP. The last example I can give you is about 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I'm not sure here. Kim, how many?
Just a couple more minutes, please.
Okay, very quickly. So in September 2015, we were told that welfare was no longer accepting a document which is called a verification of status document, which is a document that people who are born outside the province can get to confirm their status. What that meant was that thousands of people were going to be cut off their welfare because they couldn't produce the proper ID. When we and the reason we found out was because welfare workers were I worked for an ID program. Welfare workers were talking to us every day and telling us about the chaos that this was causing, that they couldn't give people assistance because they didn't have the problem. And so we began to organize around, okay, what do we do with that? And so we took a delegation to welfare unannounced, had a huge meeting with them to try and emphasize that this is not logical. This will create, extreme destitution for people. It will fill their hostels, and they refused to accept it. So then we had a press conference in front of Mayor Tory's office, and took two people who had been cut off with us, and we had a meeting in the back room, and had a long discussion with the mayor's office. Some welfare people were there, one to get the welfare reinstated for the people who were cut off, but secondly also for to make sure that this stopped, that this policy of not giving people relief or welfare if they didn't have the proper ID. And by the way, the verification of status document had been accepted throughout all of the time prior to that. So in the end, what happens is that both men receive their welfare. And the following Monday, we get a call from a welfare worker who says that the policy had been reversed, that welfare would again accept the verification of status document. Now, the reason this is very important is because the two groups that were involved around this were OCAP and No One's Illegal. We got together on September 18th. The next day, we went and had that. We tried to work with the agencies, but the agencies were too slow. It was important to move fast here. So within about 6-7 weeks, we had reversed the policy, which was a disastrous policy if it kept going. And what's important here to understand, I'll just finish with this, is as if you're a worker that works in an agency and you come across situations where this is an impossible situation, we have an obligation to speak out. Had we not spoken out, had OCAP and No One's Legal not confronted welfare and the mayor's office around this issue, and just said, well, okay, this is the way it is, it would have been a disastrous situation where thousands and thousands of people have been rejected on welfare, and very vulnerable people. And again, although it didn't make a lot of news, it was probably one of the most important. I'll finish there. One of the most important action that OCAP took, and No One Is Evil, to fight against this policy that was just really discriminatory and also racist, because it targeted a lot of racialized people. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Gaetan. Just want to say I was born and raised in Toronto. I've lived here my whole life, and this is all new to me, most of it. So I really appreciate all the information. Thank you. We're going to now move from talking about the history of these issues to more current day discussion with A.J. Withers. A.J. is a longtime anti-poverty activist and author of 3 books. Their most recent book is Fight to Win, Inside Poor People's Organizing. That's where the title of this event came from. So welcome, A.J.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks to the JCSJ for having me. Gaetan is a tough act to follow, but I always learn so much from you, Gaetan, whenever you talk, so thank you for that. So I'm going to sort of start where we are right now and move back in time and see how far we get, just in the interest of time. Maybe I'll get to where Gaetan left off, or maybe I won't. But I'm just going to read a little bit from this book because it still captures a lot of what's happening with the encampments right now. Throughout the pandemic, 2 dominant discourses or narratives were deployed by the ruling regime, the city: urban order and safety. This is what Danya Fast and David Cunningham call the soft left hand of the state being paired with the hard right hand of criminalization. The hard right hand is used in an urban order discourse rooted in neoliberal values and aesthetics. It is exemplified in Ontario Premier Doug Ford's comments, quote, "You can't do it in a public park. You just can't. Number 1, I think it looks terrible," end quote. There was no number 2. Ford recognized that some people don't want to go into shelters because they can have terrible conditions. Quote, "They say some people get beat up. They get their stuff stolen," end quote. There's a law and order issue here, and the safety and dignity of people in the shelters is casually dismissed when it's weighed against a bylaw offense. Ford concludes, quote, "Just don't hang out in the parks. Simple," end quote. But nothing's simple when you have nowhere else to live, especially in a global pandemic when practically everything is closed and congregate spaces are especially risky. Safety became the city's watchword to legitimize forced encampment. In the context of the pandemic, the safety of encamped residents who did not want to risk staying in congregate settings because of COVID exposure is irrelevant. Safety was also mobilized to protect the neighborhood residents. Encampment residents, however, are disentitled from any claim to residency in the park, in the neighborhood, or even the city. The most important residents are those who own property and risk devaluation if these aesthetic failures are allowed to remain nearby. Encampment residents pose a security threat to the capital investment of residential property owners have in a financialized housing market. Like the homeless folks who hung out in St. James Park, encampment residents were scapegoated for disorder around the parks where they lived. Encampment residents seemed to be blamed for every single needle nearby. They were also blamed for fires, garbage, noise, rats, crime, theft, threats against city park staff, and on and on. Encampment residents were also blamed for, quote, homophobic graffiti and the screaming of anti-gay slurs, end quote. Here imagined to be perpetrators of hate, but not the victims of it, even though they were often targeted for living in encampments, especially by police. Many residents, too, were queer and trans. The disorder and the criminality that encampment residents were depicted as bringing, often with little or no evidence, were used to justify collective punishment and eradication of these spaces. The soft left hand of the state, however, routinely evokes concern about encampment residents while having repeatedly threatened and actually served encampment residents with eviction notices. City staff and council appear to believe that they know what is best for this group, and if they forcibly remove them from public space, they will go into the shelter system because this, they claim, is the safest option. This is an instrumental violence, a violence for a specific purpose, used to accomplish a goal. Like so many violences that undergird many of the decisions on behalf of the poor and oppressed people by people who say that they mean well. For the mayor and councilors, it seems obvious. Inside is better than outside. Warm is better than cold. But things are more complicated on the ground. It's probably obvious that some of the reasoning behind inside being better than outside is overly simplistic. There still isn't an inside to go into. The shelters are full. For the first time, no doubt at least in part because of our collective efforts, the Shelter Support and Housing Administration had to collect and release information about how many people requesting shelter beds it was turning away, rather than only the 4 a.m. bed count that it normally released. It was an average of 38 people a day. SSHA tried to downplay the significance of this data, implying that it was the fault of the person asking for shelter because it didn't, quote, suit their needs, preferences, end quote. A need or a preference here could be a woman asking for a space when there were no spots for women, or a wheelchair user trying to get an accessible bed. The Environmental Justice and Sustainability Clinic at Osgoode Hall Law School and Fact Check Toronto, an organization Melissa Goldstein and I started to counter the lies and misleading statements that the city puts out about housing and homelessness, dug deeper into this data. We found that between October 30th, 2020 and February 28th, 2021, at least 13,780 people were told that there was no shelter available when they called. And 4,577 people still did not have a bed at 4 a.m. when they were erased from the system. This doesn't count the people who refused shelter because it wasn't appropriate, adequate, or accessible, or the people who were cut off or hung up after a long period on hold. For the first time, we could use the city's internal data to show what we had been saying all along. The city turns people away from shelter every night. Having no inside available space hollowed out the city's position that inside is better than outside. Forced decampment also risks COVID-19 transmission. The city was going against a warning from the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. Quote, clearing encampments can cause people to disperse throughout the community and break connections with service providers. This increases the potential for infectious disease spread, end quote. The CDC recommended leaving encampments intact unless there are individual housing options available. Additionally, encampment evictions have not resulted in people going inside. They have resulted in people going deeper into the metaphorical and often literal woods and being dislocated from their supports, but not necessarily going inside. At the same time, the city had by May 19th, 2021, over 1,600 cases of COVID in the shelter system. Now it's about 2,800 cases, I think. The city's winter plan includes moving people into congregate settings, yet frontline workers, including those conducting COVID tests, have found almost no cases of COVID in the encampments. How does safety fit the realities of the pandemic dispersal and dispossession? Further, if safety is the issue, why weren't encampments provided running water in the hot summer or provided hand washing stations throughout the pandemic? The city refused to dispatch its water trucks to encampments, and in Moss Park, it locked the potable water away from people. Instead, tens of thousands of individual bottles of water were donated by the community, much of it collected by the Interfaith Coalition to Fight Homelessness, and distributed through the encampment support network. The city withheld the basic necessities of life. So that was talking about, I was writing that sort of in May through June of 2021. And not much has changed. And right now that we're in May is really a key time because the city's shelter system is always full. It's always turning people away. but it also relies on people leaving the shelter system when it warms up. The city has made it clear in some documents, and we've shown this, that it requires people to exit the system. It closes beds down come the spring. And the only way the shelter system can continue to function is if people leave to go camp outside. Yet they've criminalized camping outside. So what they require is for people to be fully invisible. You can go sleep outside, but you can't have the things that will potentially protect your life and keep you safer, like a tent. And so this is where we're at right now, where there are people who are likely having to leave the shelter system because beds are being lost. And also, many people don't feel safe in the shelter system. One thing that the book doesn't talk about is that we also found through our research that between March of 2016 and March of 2021, there were over 10,000 instances of reported violence in the shelter system. I imagine that many instances aren't reported. If you are involved in a violent incident, there's a very high likelihood that both people will be kicked out regardless of who the victim is. So a lot of things don't get reported because people are worried that they will be thrown out and lose their space. So 10,000 instances of violence in the shelter system in that time period. So when Doug Ford just dismisses some people get beat up, there's like a very real fear. People are very traumatized from their time in the shelter system. During the pandemic, the city opened up shelter hotels, and this was a really key site of advocacy that people fought for. People even actually sued the city to implement social distancing. And then the city brought in shelter hotels where people could be one person per hotel room. Right now, there's just under 3,200 people in the shelter hotels. We're not sure how many because the city has begun closing those spaces. And it makes up 40% of the shelter system. By April of 2023, the city plans to have eliminated all of those spaces. They don't have the room to replace those spaces. They aren't going to open up as many beds back into the shelter system as existed before. And there are not enough shelter beds for all of the people that are currently in the system, let alone all of the people that are trying to get into the system. We have said that the shelter system is in a state of collapse. The head of Shelter Support and Housing Administration went on national television and said that the city doesn't need any help. And that's a really different thing than what Gaetan was talking about in 1998 when the city declared homelessness a national disaster. Under John Tory, he's fine with people dying if it means promoting this public image of the city not needing help. And so, like Gaetan said, federal help and provincial help are desperately needed, and housing is desperately needed. And we're just at this utter state of complete disaster. We fought really hard for beds when the shelter system was at its absolute worst. Many of us were involved in a really long, hard fight for 1,000 beds. And we won those beds in 2018. And that was a massive victory. But by the time we won those beds, we already needed 1,500 beds. And we couldn't imagine things being worse in 2018. And now here we are with like so many more people who have lost their housing, with some things so much worse. And as like I said, May is a really important time because as people become more visible, as things warm up, the mayor also in 2020 and in 2021, as we found through Freedom of Information Act requests, the mayor wants a spring plan both of those years. And shortly after asking for a spring plan, the wheels began, policy wheels come into motion to begin violent mass evictions of encampments. In 2021, those plans began in January, even though a human rights plan was put forward to city staff that would mean that violent evictions didn't have to happen. They wouldn't have to happen anyways, but even in their framework. And they rejected that in favor of really violent evictions that most of you have probably seen pictures of. And so this is what we're headed for again. And yeah, there needs to be like increasing mobilization for support, increasing like education of our neighbors to support people in encampments, and increasing calls on the mayor to change this approach of violent encampment evictions, because really what is happening is people are just being moved along, and really just the communities and safety that they create in encampments are being disrupted, and it's really only causing significant harm. I think there was one other thing that I wanted to say. I can't remember, but so I think a couple of things just moving forward. We have had a couple of really important articles come out in the past week, and there's one more coming out, if not tomorrow, Monday or Tuesday, in Counterpunch about the mayor's and city staff's involvement in planning encampment evictions. Oh, and the other thing is, those are in a publication online called Counterpunch, and one's in Briar Patch. And this discourse around safety, a lot of it has to do with fires safety. And we've demonstrated that the city has inflated the number of fires that happened in order to make encampments look more dangerous. And yeah, the city has really demonized this group of people in multiple different ways in order to justify these violent evictions. And so one of the things that they did as well is they created these sort of intense surveillance reports of everyone that lived in one of the encampments that they gave to many, many staff, that said things like, this person will react badly if rushed. This person uses a lot of harm reduction materials. This person said it's a war against the city and does karate. Like many significant notes on encampment residents planning to go into the evictions. And one of the things that was really significant for me was that the plan was wake people up at 6 a.m. and give them 2 hours before they have to be out of the encampment to pack up everything they own. And there were many, many people that they had written about them. This person will respond badly if rushed. And the only time period they put in there, they said, this person will respond badly with rush, but will be fine if given sufficient time, in brackets, 2 days. And yet they chose to give people 2 hours. They chose to refuse people access to their supports, and they set things up. They like built a powder keg and it exploded at Trinity Bellwoods. And then they decided to try that again 2 other places. So that's where we are right now. And the only way that things are going to get better is through organizing, like Gaetan was saying. A lot of what's been won has been won through organizing. I'll leave it there. My cat really is desperate for something.
Thanks very much, HA. We have a lot of time for questions. And in a moment, I'm going to turn over to Susan, who's going to read some of the questions that we've had submitted. I'm going to start out with a couple of questions of my own. following from your discussion, AJ, I think one of the hotels is Bond Place, right? Yeah. So if any of you are on Twitter, just yesterday I discovered an account on Twitter, which is a Bond Place. It's sort of keeping a record of the stuff that's going on there. And I mean, I know a little bit about some of the things that you're talking about. A lot of it's been in the news, but it's more horrendous than you can imagine. And just the thread that I came across was a record of these, I can't remember what they call them. It's like wellness checks. So if you're housed in Bond Place, they barge into your room and they do a check on a regular basis. And just so you know, I mean, some of the stuff that they're doing, it's completely unnecessary. It's to intimidate people. There are women who have put notes on their doors saying, please, only women doing the wellness checks in my room. They have men just barge in, when people are undressed or in the middle of the night, when they're trying to sleep. I mean, all of this is, it's not just inefficiency or incompetence. It's malice, it's intimidation, it's meanness, it's I don't know if you have any comment on that, either of you.
Yeah, so the Voices of the Bond Twitter account, I think, is amazing, and I really recommend folks check it out. And folks from the Bond have done surveys of people and are putting up the results of the survey, often with photos. The wellness checks, keep people from sleeping, and there have been a lot of really intense privacy concerns and people being triggered by those invasions. The wellness checks are also important. And so this is one of the things about the contradictions entirely of shelter hotels, that shelter hotels are terrible. And also they're so much better than the rest of the hotel, the shelter system. And so we fought for the shelter hotels to exist, and then very quickly fought for people not to be forcibly put into them and for the conditions to be better. But the wellness checks exist, I think you're right, as a form of the exercise of power. And they should not exist for many, many people. For people who use opiates, some people need to have wellness checks to check that they are okay, because there's a toxic drug supply that people are dying from. And so there has been a push from people who do harm reduction to implement better checks on people. But for the people who don't need wellness checks, why are they having wellness checks? So it's part of this sort of institutional logic where it's like, we're not capable of viewing you as a human being, or engaging with you in any meaningful way. We are just going to barge down every door. And that is disgusting. And it's really disruptive. And also, they're important for some people.
Yeah, they're important for some people, but they could be done much better. Yeah. Thank you. Gaetan, did you have a response? You need to unmute.
Okay, sorry. So very quickly, I worked in social services for 35 years. Discussions around how to create the perfect hostel, the perfect drop-in, the perfect hotel are really, really important in some ways to make. But really what we're talking about here is the context, right? We're talking about unhoused people, people who are living in conditions that they were never meant to live in. And we spend so much energy trying to, and we're forced to do this because we have thousands of people who are now living in shelters and hotels. And I remember in the drop-in having a discussion around a TV, 100 people, which channel are we going to watch? Have you ever tried to do that? It's an impossible situation. My wife and I can't decide, we have one TV and we can't decide. I guess my main point is that until we deal with the housing crisis, and until we deal with the income issue, which are two major issues, which means that all levels of governments have to get involved. We can't, how should I say this? We can't bring order to chaos. The living conditions of people who are living in these conditions is chaotic, the majority of the time. So until we create movements that we're going to be forced to have these discussions about, what's the best way to put, 100 people in the better living, building. Is it to put glass partitions between them? Is it to, anyways, I took part in so many of those discussions that it's hard because agencies will spend, I've been to many meetings discussing these kinds of issues about violence, about all that kind of stuff in the agency, and very little time, talking about, how do we force the government to act on the housing crisis and the lack of income.
And I remembered what I wanted to talk about before, and adding to what you were saying, Gaetan, is that right now the policy that we have in place around homelessness is called Housing First. Sounds great. If any of you wanted to look to another place to design a homelessness policy, I think probably the last or one of the last places you would look is the United States to model off this. But Canada looked to George Bush's homelessness policy and has implemented that across the country. And what it does is it really only works to provide supports for anyone that's been homeless for 6 months or longer, and which in Toronto right now is 75% of the people. And it does that because these are like the expensive people. So it works to house these people in order to save money. And the idea is they take up most of the shelter space. So you can cut down shelters, house these folks, and boom, much of the problem is solved. And we don't have to inject new resources into the system. And so because of this ideology, the city of Toronto is only creating supportive housing for people. So all of the new units that are for unhoused people to go into are supportive housing units. And that's because all of the unhoused people who have been homeless for 6 months or longer are viewed as being somehow pathological. There's something fundamentally wrong with them as people, and that's why they're homeless, and that's why they need to go into supportive housing, because they're not capable of living independently on their own. They need some form of supports. This is obviously super messed up. But that's what the system is doing right now. So there's no housing, there's no deeply affordable housing that's being built for people. There's no recognition of the real state of housing crisis that we're in. We need hundreds of thousands of deeply affordable housing units built in this city. That's what gets us out of a housing crisis. We don't need 18,000 supportive housing units. Like, sure, great, give us those too. Some people definitely need a supportive housing, but that's not the solution. And that's the only solution that's being offered. And it traps a lot of people into a kind of housing that they don't want, and that is institutional for a lot of people.
Thank you. I actually have another question which touches a bit on that, but I'm gonna, I don't want to hog the floor, so I'm gonna pass on to Susan right now. Susan has some other questions. Susan?
How about this question? What do either of you think about a guaranteed income? Do you think that might go some ways to resolve the ongoing housing issue?
I don't think it will. So the problem is, there's a lot of problems with the guaranteed income, but the way that the guaranteed income is sort of being put forward right now is within this neoliberal economy. So I'm totally in favor of people getting more money. I'm not against that. But the problem is, as long as we have a financialized housing market and capitalism, but let's start with the financialized housing market, then if tenants get more money, rents just go up. It doesn't really do anything for people. Unless we have the housing problem actually fixed and people have deeply affordable housing, only giving people more income doesn't actually do anything to resolve the housing crisis. It actually might speed things up to make it worse. So people need material goods and material support. And then one of the problems with a guaranteed basic income is that it takes this social safety net that we have that has all these holes and is really inadequate, and it turns it into a tightrope. And then you get another government cut. So right now, this safety net isn't enough, but when they cut it, it just makes another hole over here or a hole over here. But if they take away the safety net and turn it into a tightrope, when they make those cuts, people just fall and they hit the concrete. And so I think that it's a really dangerous thing being proposed by folks like the liberal government, who they blatantly only say, we're there to support the working or the middle class and people who are working hard to get there. If you don't have middle class aspirations or are part of it, we've abandoned you.
I wonder if Gaetan wouldn't mind commenting on that, because the question just makes me think of some of the things he was saying about during the Depression and other times when people were given financial support to help them get basic things like food and shelter. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on basic income?
The first thing I have to say is that during the Great Depression, the amount of money that they gave, barely, kept them alive. They just barely survived. The unemployed back then called it, starving, relief. They couldn't feed their families with that amount of money. And historically, that's always been the case in terms of welfare, in terms of people on welfare. They can never, pay their rent and eat. And that was true with my family and many other families. The other thing is that, everything that those people got, they fought for. And that's really important to understand, because it wasn't until after the Second World War, after 10 years of fighting and the veterans came back, that the so-called welfare state was created in Canada. Unemployment insurance, national housing program, and that was created. And ultimately, you just have to make sure that people have enough money to live on, that they can pay their rent, they can eat. And the guaranteed income, there's no indication that will allow you to do that. I'm now, technically on guaranteed income. I'm on a pension, and and my wife is, we're both living on income that is limited. And for many seniors, we're just living on the edge. Our housing, we're protected. How we're protected from the housing crisis right now? We live in a co-op, right? Could Kathy and I afford a $2,100 apartment in Toronto? No, we wouldn't survive. So, and also, these income programs that we talk about, unemployment insurance and welfare, are not just for homeless people and people who are, they're for all of us, and anybody who wants to know what it's like to live without that safety net, so-called safety net wealth. Go back and look at the history of in the 1930s, what happened to people and how they suffered. They suffered greatly. And when I was unemployed, last time for 16 months, my wife Catherine got sick. She got cancer, and if we hadn't had the unemployment, if I wasn't receiving unemployment at the time, if we didn't have the health care, paid for, we'd be on the streets. So I really, really want people to understand that this attack against the social programs that has been going on since 1975 is very important, because it will affect all of us if they win. And we're feeling it now in terms of the housing crisis. And many of us are feeling now in terms of income, given the inflation and all of that stuff going on, particularly seniors and people on welfare, but others also.
Right. So I think you sort of answered one of these other questions, which is based on each of your decades of experience organizing, what are the factors that you think are most important in fighting to win, whether it's housing or whatever? I mean, Gaetan, you just talked about the importance of the social supports that we have. AJ, do you have any other comments or?
Well, I like in taking the question a little bit differently, and thanks for the question, Susan. I think also in fighting to win, like, we need communities. And that's the most important thing that we have. And that's something that the JCSJ builds, which is really important. Poor folks don't have resources, but they have a lot of people, and building communities and building networks that support each other is the most important thing to be able to respond to crises and build up the strength that we need to fight for the material stuff that we need.
Okay, and another question, what can people here do to help fight for safe shelter and rent geared to income housing? Organize more battles and demonstrations and
organize a battle. Yeah, I think JCSJ has like done a lot of great support work, and things like contacting your counselor or the mayor around calling for housing and not to evict the encampments, calling for more shelter beds. The Shelter and Housing Justice Network, I don't know why that was difficult, has an electronic toolkit. And so I think it's shjn.net.
Yeah.
You can sign up to the list, you can come to the meetings, but also there's an electronic toolkit that gets updated from time to time that folks can check out, and there will be in-person actions if they're coming up, or any kind of calls to write somewhere, or call someone, or that sort of thing.
Gaetan, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, again, looking back to the 1930s, I mean, what happened is there were people calling for a change in the system. It's very clear that there were communist and socialist organizations, the CCF, the Commonwealth, Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which is a precursor to NDP, and who were organizing in poor communities. And they were very, very good at organizing in those communities. They didn't just take over, relief offices and hold people hostage and that kind of stuff. They had social networks, right? They played sports, baseball. They had baseball games, they had soccer games. They had music. They had dances. You know, there was a community where families would come together. They knew each other, and they would organize and mobilize around those issues. And I didn't talk about some of those in some of those takeovers. You know, a band would come in, and the people would be square dancing in the middle of the action and that kind of stuff. So I mean, so in the end, you do need, you know, a vision of what we want and what we need. And you need an infrastructure to help you do that. I know that when I first came to Dundas and Sherburne in the late 1980s, you know, there were key people, you know, like Berg German, you know, John Clark, Kathy Crow, Kathy Hartle, a whole bunch of other people who influenced the culture of the people who work in the agencies in terms of what to do about that. So if you see the stuff, you know, particularly if you work in an agency and stuff, I worked in drop-in for 10 years, you see all the stuff that goes on. You have an obligation to speak, and you have to create infrastructure that will begin to do that. And the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, which didn't exist when I grew up in poverty in Burlington and in Quebec, you know, was central in terms of being that voice, you know, that would speak to not just, you know, the wealthy and the middle class, but would speak directly to poor people. We need to speak directly to each other. And we all understand, and lastly, we all understand that there are certain things that we need to survive, some basic things around education, transportation, housing, you name it, income, that are necessary. And we need a different vision, because the system that we have right now has no interest at all in making sure that those most basic needs are being met right now. And that's not just true, you know, in Toronto and across the country, but across the world. And has to stop, and we have to figure out a way to do that. And there were people that over the, you know, long period of time did organize and talk about these things.
Thank you. Here's another question. How do we combat NIMBYism when trying to achieve housing solutions? And I think this is true in wealthy and or family-oriented neighborhoods, when there are moves to introduce supportive housing, or just rent geared to income housing, or just more affordable housing. I live close to the East York neighborhood, and there was a big controversy because some modular homes were being built, or are being built, or have been built. And people were so upset because they just didn't want them in the neighborhood. And to me, this seemed like a great solution to take a parking lot and build these units for people that would be, you know, provide affordable housing. So anyway, would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, you know, in the last 30 years, you know, that I worked at Dundas and Sherburne, you know, we had many encounters with you know, people who, you know, try to push, you know, services out of the neighborhood and that kind of stuff. And I think the only way that you can change that attitude, in my mind, is to organize, you know, poor communities and people, you know, who, you know, whether it be the unemployed or unhoused, whatever, and that we build organizations that can begin to push back. I mean, you know, we're talking about people, you know, people have invested in these homes. These are their investments, and they're more concerned about that than they are about your well-being. You know, one of those organizations, you know, killed a drop-in, one of the largest drop-in in the city, a weekend drop-in, the Central Neighborhood House. They pushed it out of there until it died, and they didn't care. I mean, I don't. I mean, some people can spend a lot of time trying to convince these people that, you know, poor people are humans. We're real. You know, we're just like them. We bleed and all that kind of stuff. My energy for me is if you really want to begin to address that, is to, again, to build movements amongst the, you know, poor communities to try and push back, because you will need to fight back, and if you're going to fight back, you need resources, and without a movement, you won't get those resources.
Thanks. AJ, did you have a comment on that question?
Yeah, I agree. Like, I know that during the pandemic, some folks have tried the other way as well and joined their resident groups where they're near encampments and tried to engage with their neighbors. And that hasn't, when it's a group of neighbors who are particularly out to get an encampment, those gentle conversations did not go well. But when, like, so OCAP had done things like a street party, like taking public space back, or more recently, Sue Ann Levy, who was a Sun columnist, had been really like working with a bunch of residents, or like pumping out their racist anti-poor message. So OCAP put posters against her in the neighborhood, sort of making it clear that she was terrible, but also that like, you're next if you keep this up. So I think like that's sort of our style, but also near the Roehampton Shelter Hotel, there people started, there was really anti-homeless vitriol going on, and folks started a Friends of the Roehampton, which hung out with folks that lived there and helped people like build a garden and do really community-based stuff that wasn't directly combative in the same way, but was community building, but also wasn't about like, we're gonna try and bring you over to our side, but so like sort of in between those two things.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a matter of, I mean, maybe it's easy to say, but I remember reading an article about that Roehampton. They interviewed one of the residents and how thrilled that person was to have a safe space, their own space. And it was just, I don't know, I think it's so easy for people to demonize some of these people that need the shelter. So I don't know. Anyway, but sometimes it is just a matter of trying to see the other side of the picture. Sorry, that's my 2 cents. I'm supposed to be neutral here and just reading the questions. So AJ, I think you sort of answered this question in advance when you were talking about the different levels of government, but this question says, given that most urban centers and their housing challenges fall under the administration of 3 levels of government, is it realistic to think a workable solution to the housing crisis is even possible?
Well, just to add to what sort of both Gaetan and I have said around like the federal government needs to be involved and the provincial government needs to be involved, that they use that to do nothing. Each level of government uses that over and over to do nothing. And the federal government, the way that they take action is they create funding schemes that require provincial governments to put in an equal amount in order for those housing funding schemes to work. So the federal government makes all the terms and the rules and then designs it to fall apart. And so they get the PR, but they don't actually have to build any housing. They don't have to do it that way. The federal government can build housing with the municipal government and bypass the terrible provincial government that we have right now. They're choosing not to do that because they don't actually care, in my view. And so one thing that we can all do is push back anytime any government tries to say it's their jurisdiction or we need support from them, like actually knowing how much money they have or when a program they've done before worked and responding with those answers and saying, you can do this. Like Danielle and I were in a meeting, and Bob, with the MP for Dundas and Sherburne area, and she tried to pull that. And then we said, like, you've done this before. This is when you've done it directly with the city. You can do it again. And she was shocked because she thought she was going to just get away with it. And yeah, they just keep doing it, and we can't stand for it anymore.
Can I just add very quickly? The danger that we have around dealing with all three levels of governments is to have, you know, and not to say we shouldn't have done this in terms of meeting with the MP, is to have a lot of, you know, backroom discussions around, you know, what we need and what we don't want, because these discussions have to happen in public and on the streets. They you know, I'm watching the French elections right now, in terms of what was going on, you know, and there was a big battle between three groups, you know, Macron, but also the far right, but there's a really interesting group on the left, far left, that is there. And when you listen to those people and the vision, the program that they have, it is possible to put a vision and a movement forward that says, you know, what we have right now as an economic system in our country, and I would say in most countries, you know, has to be gotten rid of. We have to eliminate. We can't continue to kill the earth. We can't continue to allow the degree of poverty to increase to the degree that we have now, where those lines keep growing and growing and growing, where you have a percentage of the population that has all of the wealth and the majority of the population is living in poverty. We can't allow that to happen. And the best way to do that is to begin to talk to each other, not spend so much time trying to negotiate with these, you know, I won't use any swear with these people, like with these politicians. You know, are you telling me that Mayor Tory that doesn't understand, doesn't see the destitution every effing day that he goes out into the streets? That he doesn't see that you know, the liberal MP that in an area doesn't see what's going on in this neighborhood, and we've had 30 years, like, since the national housing, and nothing is being done, you know. And so the thing that we have to learn to do it, and eventually we'll be forced to do that, right? Because if we don't do it, you know, we're all in trouble. And I think many youth are beginning to understand that, particularly around the environment, but also around other issues. We live in a very, very dangerous world right now, where we can spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on a war, you know, between Ukraine and the U.S. and Russia, or whatever, and somehow we have no money for our people. We have to figure out a way to move out of that, and maybe look at old movements, or maybe create our own. But I'm an old man, you know, and it's hard to watch.
Thank you. This is a rather depressing topic or question, but there was a recent CTV news report that described how a woman with severe disabilities is finding it easier to apply for medically assisted death than it is for her to obtain affordable housing that won't exacerbate her chronic illness. Would either of you like to comment on this?
Disabled folks said that this was going to happen when they were making MAID, that it's a fundamental injustice to not provide people with the supports that they need to survive, and then make it really easy to die. And here we are. This is where we knew we would be. It's really sad. This is really sad, and this is one of many instances where this is happening. And yeah, we need to fight for more for disabled folks and for everyone. One thing that I'm disabled, and I've been a part of disability justice organizing for a while. And one thing that I really am uncomfortable with is that a lot of people make this exceptionalism around disability, where people will say, oh, DSP, disability social assistance, needs to be raised. And why isn't that being raised? There needs to be a national disability benefit. Screw everyone else. And the reason that that happens is because disabled people are viewed as somehow deserving, as somehow like justly entitled to resources, and other poor people are undeserving or they're lazy. And that's a division that actually helps divide poor people and is really damaging. So we need resources for disabled people. No disabled person should ever be faced with that kind of decision. And also, no one should be in the position where they don't have adequate housing, disabled or not.
I won't answer the question directly. I just want to pick up on something that AJ said, and I grew up in Ontario housing in Burlington, Ontario, with my 4 other siblings. My father was in and out of psych wards. My mom, she cleaned houses for rich people, all their life. And what I remember of those years, until I was about 30 or whatever, is the chaos and the conflict. Although we were housed, we just didn't have the income to survive. We just didn't have it. And what I remember the most is this all of this energy, or all of this these feelings that you're having are kind of internalized inside that home. So a lot of your anger is sometimes aimed at your family members, whether your father or sibling or whatever, and that's what happens. So when people are caught in this poverty, and many of us for years and years and years, are stuck with trying to deal with what we're seeing, not understanding, because I was a child, what is going on. And it wasn't until I came to Dundas and Sherburne and saw thousands and thousands of other people that I began to understand, what had happened to my family. And so that's important, because once you begin to be able to see some of these things, and you begin to understand that there are things that are affecting the life that you're living, the situation you're in, whether you have a disability and you can't find housing, there are things that have led to these conditions, and it's not complicated. You can find it if you look for it, and the minute you do that, you begin to come out of that and understand, because it's a big thing to understand where your family and all the chaos. It's a big thing to try and deal with that. But then once you understand, okay, this is what happened to my dad, this is what happened to us, and then you begin, the best thing I ever did was begin to organize with other poor people. It's that simple. That simple. For me, it was that simple. But then I got work, but many families get destroyed by that. Many families will get destroyed. If you go to Jane and Finch, you go to north of Toronto, there's many communities where families are getting destroyed because of this devastation and poverty. So we have to get together and stop that, and we have to figure out how to do it, because if we don't, this system will kill us, and it has killed many of us. Many of us. AJ and I and Danielle. We have hundreds and hundreds. Sharon Cook, you just mentioned Sharon Cook around the party, the protests around. And Sharon Cook just died last week. We worked with Sharon Cook, who's a sex worker in the neighborhood. We have many, many stories like that. But if historically, that's what poor people did. They got together. The peasants got together, in the 1600s and fought back. Got rid of the kings. In France, they got rid of the kings, So certainly we can begin to look at that.
I have another question here. It actually comes from one of our members. So I'll just read it out. There's a quote from your book, AJ: "Housing first is not a slogan of the proponents but the city's official policy. It will reduce the overall costs for homelessness support, including the cost of jails and prisons. So 30 years ago in May, there was a riot on Yonge Street, which was caused by the killing of Black men by police. Racialized groups such as Black people seem to have been affected by homelessness, more affected by homelessness during the pandemic. In the recovery and resurgence period, after the pandemic control is lifted, how do you think we can recover moral economy to any better extent?
Thanks for that question. So, yeah, absolutely. People of color are really disproportionately homeless in this city and in this country, and especially Black and Indigenous people. And that, and I think that it's true. That folks are really disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, that Black and Indigenous people were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in terms of homelessness. Certainly seemed to be the case in terms of policing in encampments, that was the case. And so in terms of moral economy, how people are socially valued, that some of that work is always being done by social movements, and Black Lives Matter is a really good example of moral economy organizing around Black life and calling for a revaluing of Black life. And the slogan itself is really about moral economy, as it is also very much about material demands and police not killing Black men in particular, but Black people in general. And so I think in terms of moral economy, it's really important for, as we organize, to continue to put forward and do a better job of putting forward those kinds of demands and center the lived experiences and realities of the most marginalized people. In terms of homelessness, there's a lot of folks, homelessness is experienced really differently for different groups of folks. And so there's a lot of the kinds of visible homelessness that people see is not the entirety of homelessness. And that gets erased through Housing First policy as well. And then, so Housing First, it says that it'll save money through jail and through hospitals, et cetera. There's this sort of bizarre thing of you give someone housing and they no longer, then they become a $0 in terms of all other services. And they call jail housing, and they call hospital housing, and they call them services, and they call them supports. And these are really terrible ways of viewing people in term and what supports and services are for people. But instead of positioning people as pathological and really fundamentally devaluing them, and Housing First can pathologize people and criminalize people because they're so devalued in the moral economy. And it's so much easier to do that because homeless folks, for the most part, are marginalized in more than one way. Homeless folks are oftentimes racialized, oftentimes also like queer, trans, or women. And so Housing First can pathologize folks. And instead of doing that, like actively resisting pathologization and actively fighting for housing for all and for the revaluation of human worth, I think is really important.
Gaetan, did you have any quick comment or? No?
No, sorry. No, I'm okay.
Okay. So we're getting close to the end. I have one sort of last general question, and I don't know whether anyone wanted to submit any questions in the chat. We don't see any, but we seem to have covered a lot of ground. So maybe just as we're wrapping things up, both for AJ and for Gaetan, each of you has worked for decades as social justice and anti-poverty activists, as well as housing advocates. How do you avoid becoming cynical and pessimistic?
Well, I think for me, part of what has helped me greatly is to go back and look at the history of poor people's movements. It's that simple, and that's helped me greatly to understand that historically poor people have always fought for, and there are people that fought for what we have today in terms of housing, unemployment insurance, healthcare, and now the ball's in our hand. there are people who want to take that away. So it's one, and I just want to end by a quick kind of comment that one of my friends, Barrick, always, when I first met him, we'd go through, because there's a culture there that kind of believes, that says, and it's a kind of a Christian saying, that the poor will always be with us. And that's kind of like a mentality sometimes, or, well, what can you do? People are screwing up or whatever. We'll always have those people. And then, I don't know where Barrick heard it, but then Barrick said, well, there are 3 questions I have. I want to know, how many, how poor, and will I be one of them? And if you ask those questions and you allow a society to get to where it is now, and you can answer those questions right now, and you might have an answer for all 3 of that right now, then it's important to understand that this is about us. Somehow, thinking or believing that we won't be affected or touched by what's going on in the system, I think it's delusional. So let's understand where we are. Let's understand what we're capable of doing, and let's look what people have done in the past, and you'll see that people have been in much worse situations than us, and managed to get rid of a whole bunch of people that were very, very harmful to them.
Thank you. AJ?
Yeah, totally. I was on social assistance for a really long time, and Gaetan talked earlier about what a difference it makes to organize with poor people, and it made a really big difference in my life, and I feel really personally enriched and invested in it. I also it's really hard, times are tough right now. Things keep getting worse. And when I actually can't fathom really things being worse, and then they keep getting worse.
Yeah.
So that's really hard, but then I try and imagine what it would be like without organizing. And then I'm like, oh, it could be a lot worse. And I was talking with some people in Calgary not too long ago. They're starting to organize there against some really terrible the homeless police actions. And I made this comment about something about beds, shelter beds. And they said, oh, you have to understand there aren't beds. Everything is a mat on the floor. And then they started talking about some of the conditions in their shelters. And it just really dawned on me what it means to live in a city with such a strong base of, and such a strong history of poor people's organizing. And that things could be so much worse. And so while victories are few and far between, that when we hold what we have, that's actually a profound victory, even if it doesn't feel like it all the time. And so like right now, when people are under attack, just holding the line is really key. And that's sometimes really all I need is just to know we can just hold the line.
Thank you. You're both so inspiring. I think Kim has one more question.
I do. Just have a few more minutes, so if nobody types anything to the chat, I did want to come back to one more thing, and I don't know if this is maybe beyond the scope of this discussion because your work, AJ in particular, has been more on shelters, but I'm always thinking about affordable housing. I'm securely housed now, but when I stop working, I'm probably going to be below the poverty line. I have a relative who has just been on the list for assisted housing for more than 10 years in Toronto, has just been offered, an apartment. And in the last 2 years, I've seen a number of my friends have to move out of Toronto because they can no longer afford to live in the city. So growing up with a father who is an urban planner, I was always concerned about, the housing issues and development and planning, and been for many years reassured because when you see a lot of big developments planned, you see mention of an affordable housing component, and you think, oh, that's so great. That's really what we need. We need more of that. But it was only just pre-pandemic that I learned what a sham that whole term is. Affordable housing is kind of like the term light, L-I-T-E, on food. It doesn't have a legal meaning. It has an implication and people make assumptions, but it doesn't actually mean anything. And if anybody has seen the documentary called Push, that was when I learned what it really is all about. It's used by, the term affordable housing is used by governments and developers to reassure you that something's being done about the housing issue when it's not. Because when I hear affordable housing, I assume we're talking rent to geared, housing, and that's not at all what it is. The development at Mirvish Village, which is under construction right now, which is a bunch of high rises, high density. They made a big announcement about the affordable housing component. And this is in the movie Push. And those affordable housing units, I can't remember what it is. Someone did a calculation, and we're not talking even $1,000 a month for an apartment. It's way up there. It's not much below. I think the affordable housing term, many cities define as 80% of market rent, which is not affordable. Not when you've just lost your job, or you're, trying to piece together your income with 3 part-time jobs. So I just wonder if you have any comment on this whole issue, on the lack of awareness of affordable housing and what it means, and if anyone is doing anything about it.
So I have a lot of thoughts on that. And I recently learned a couple of things doing some research with someone who was on the call, Sheila, who is still here, and a few other people about, we co-authored a really long report which we call for short the Winter Plan, through the Shelter Housing Justice Network. But one of the things that falls under affordable housing is affordable condo ownership in the city of Toronto. So $700,000 is affordable housing. And so that was something I learned really recently. But the city of Toronto has recently changed its definition of affordable housing, but that definition is currently before the courts. It's being appealed by a developer. So it's still 80% of market rent. The new definition is much better. It is designed, I would say, intentionally to exclude people on welfare, to guarantee that people on welfare cannot afford affordable housing. But people on disability, social assistance, maybe have a chance at affording affordable housing. So it's a big improvement potentially, but it still means that if you're on welfare, you lose your housing, you're not getting housed unless you maybe get additional support somehow. And yeah, so it is really, like, you're right, Kim, it is a marketing thing. And a lot of buildings, there's a thing in planning where buildings have to give something back if they want to go above a certain height or deviate from the official plan somehow. And one of the ways they often do it is with affordable housing units. And those units are sometimes just a couple units, and or these new big, like, public-private partnership sort of deals that they do with the city. Those affordable housing units, in some places, have separate doors from separate entrances from the not affordable housing units.
The poor door.
Yeah. And this is John Tory's platform for the last election was 40,000 affordable housing units in 10 years. And that's just like shockingly low. And when you know that those units are not affordable, it's just pathetic. But it makes for a good election promise.
I was at Dundas and Sherburne for more than 30 years, and went through recessions and downs and ups and whatever. And I'll tell you, you just have to stand at the corner and listen to these politicians. The economy is booming, and you look around you, and nothing has changed. And I think many people, even the people I worked with, in the agencies that I work with, there are no raises, even if you have a job now. All of that is happening, and we're told that everything is fine, everything is great. Look at the economy, and yet, you see the exact opposite. That can really screw up your head. That you have, a whole media system, politicians and whatever, telling you that everything is okay. And you look around you and you just see nothing but destitution. Now, either, I'm doing something wrong and we're all doing something wrong, or someone's lying to me here. Someone's not telling the truth. I know what I see. I know what I saw over those 30 years, and I can make my own decisions about what has happened there over the last 30 years. And we can't continue to be duped by these governments.
Thank you very much for your comments. That takes us to the end of our time. And I just want to say there's been so much information and good discussion. We're hoping to be able to put the recording for this on our Facebook page. And I hope so, because I'd like to go over it and listen again, because there is so much in here. Anyway, thank you so much. It was great to have you here. We really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and the cats included. And hope to do more events like this soon. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.